Hello and welcome back to part 6 of this video series on why the Trinity is a false doctrine. In this video, we will continue to take a look at how Gnosticism worked its way into the early church teachings and pick up where we left off last time. The early Christian fathers, foremost Irenaeus and Tertullian, strove hard to find forms which make intelligible, in a non-Gnostic sense, the prevailing division of the one Jesus Christ. Strictly speaking, they did not succeed. German historian Adolf Harnack was forced to say, when he said, "Who can maintain that the Church ever overcame the Gnostic doctrine of the two natures or the Valentinian Docetism?" Even the later councils of the Church, which discussed the Christological problems in complicated and nowadays hardly intelligible definitions, did not manage to do this. The unity of the Church foundered precisely on this. It has often been forgotten that Gnostic theologians saw Christ as consubstantial with the Father before ecclesiastical theology established this as a principle in order to preserve his full divinity. End quote. As the Gnostics had claimed that Jesus was a manifestation of the highest God, sent to rescue mankind from the clutches of the evil Creator, this meant that Jesus and the God of the Old Testament were effectively working against each other. In response, John would evidently write to provide the world with the teachings of Jesus, which highlighted not only his genuine humanity, but his unity of purpose with the old God of Judaism. For example, in John chapter 8, verse 40 and 54, it says, "But now you are seeking to kill me, a man who has told you the truth that I heard from God. Abraham did not do this." Verse 54 says, "Jesus answered, 'If I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. It is my Father who glorifies me, of whom you say he is our God.'" And John chapter 10, verse 27 through 30 says, "My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me, and I give them life in the age to come, and they will absolutely not perish, and no one will snatch them out of my hand. My Father, who has given them to me, is greater than all, and no one is able to snatch them out of the Father's hand. I and the Father are one." Yet the philosophers who quickly filled the church in the apostolic twilight within less than a few years of John's writing began to view his gospel in a fundamentally different way, namely that John presented a Christ who was not simply united with the Creator in divine purpose, but also in divine substance. Indeed, the later Christian theologians at the Council of Nicaea in 325 would agree upon a particular metaphysical word to define the relationship between God and his Son. That word is Homoousios, or same substance. This term did not come to the church from the teachings of Christ or any of his apostles. The origin of this precise philosophical delineation appears by all accounts to have been the dreaded Gnostics themselves. Evidently, the Gnostic parties against whom John had struggled to preserve the faith would eventually provide the very doctrinal language that would prove the faith's undoing, and with his own gospel as the catalyst. It is a largely forgotten fact that the Homoousian definition was first in use not by the earliest Christian community, but by various Gnostic sects by at least the 2nd century CE. Scholarship is in total agreement that there is no tangible usage of it before the Gnostics. The Christians who agreed upon the word at the Council of Nicaea not only did not learn it from the New Testament, they likewise did not learn it from any Orthodox Christian theologian. As Professor Pierre Franco Beatrice explains, where he says, "The outdated thesis that the word homoousios was merely the Greek equivalent of the Latin una substantia, and that the introduction of the definition at Nicaea was only the adoption of the Western tradition of Tertullian, is definitely to be rejected." End quote. Indeed, Tertullian had used the Latin una substantia in his own doctrines, but Tertullian actually uses the Latin consubstantialis or consubstantius, when translating the acutely Gnostic word Homoousios in his writings against the Valentinians. Furthermore, Tertullian had used the idea of divine substance in a material sense, but at Nicaea, consubstantiality was specifically interpreted in an immaterial sense. Ultimately, there is no evidence at all of an Orthodox or Roman interpretation of Homoousios that would have anticipated the formula adopted at Nicaea, as scholars reveal, where they say the early history of the Nicene Homoousios shows us that the theologians of the Church were probably made aware of this concept and thus of the doctrine of emanation by the Gnostics. End quote. The Nicene implementation of this Gnostic term was arguably the single most critical and controversial application of any theological word in the history of Christianity, and remains the most fundamental tenet of orthodoxy to this day. However, as we will discover later, the recommendation of this definition was first made at the Council of Nicaea, not by any established Christian theologian, but by Constantine the Great, an unbaptized Roman emperor. But how did the pre-Nicene Gnostics first use the term homoousios, and where did they learn it? As scholars explain, the Gnostics evidently drew this word from their Egyptian and Hermetic sources, introducing it for the first time into the Christian lexicon. In other words, its origin is decidedly pagan. Scholars believe that it was used to indicate identity of the substance between generating and generated, and to describe the relationship between beings compounded of kindred substance, and was used alongside notions of emanation. We find the earliest Gnostic use of homoousios in Basilides, who lived from 117 to 138 CE. He was a popular teacher from Alexandria. Other Gnostics, such as the Valentinian Claudius Ptolemy, who lived from 90 to 168 CE, can also be found using this term. Long before any Orthodox councils adopted the word, Ptolemy wrote that it is the nature of the good God to beget and bring forth that which is similar to it, and homoousios. However, this was not the only pre-Nicene contact Christendom would have with this term. A widely unknown fact of church history is that homoousios had already been banned by Christian councils before it ever came to be accepted in 325 CE at Nicaea. The Synod of Antioch in 268 CE had met to deal with the Bishop of Antioch, Paul of Samosata, who had claimed that the divine Logos indwelt the human Jesus at his baptism. Paul had used the word homoousios to describe the relationship between the Logos, which he viewed as an impersonal attribute, and God. This term was seen as alien to Christianity. One encyclopedia reports, where it says it must be regarded as certain that the council rejected the term homoousios. Ironically, the Council of Nicaea, some 57 years later, employed the very same language in its confession of faith about the relation of the Son to the Father. This proved to be an embarrassing situation for Nicaea's supporters. The fact that the word had already been banned by the well-respected council at Antioch was repeatedly recalled by the Arians and other opponents of the Nicene Creed in order to prove the unacceptability of the term. Despite the word's established ban, however, it would eventually be forced into the service of orthodoxy. But how did the later Christians at Nicaea use the term homoousios? How was it viewed by Emperor Constantine, who personally resurrected the word and codified it into Christian and Roman law? One scholar writes that having excluded any relationship between the Nicene homoousios and the preceding Christian tradition, Constantine's view of the term came straight from Constantine's Hermetic Gnostic background. In the theological language of Egyptian paganism, the word homoousios meant that the Nous Father and the Logos Son, who are two distinct beings, share the same perfection of the divine nature. Hermeticism, one of the several pagan religions associated with the Emperor Constantine, was a mystical Gnostic tradition which blended the doctrines and mythology of Greece and ancient Egypt. Ultimately, the use of Homoousios and Constantine's knowledge of Hermeticism evidences the lingering presence of Gnostic thought forms at Nicaea. As we will see later on in this series, we know that the original Nicene understanding of the term was Hermetic Gnostic, since Constantine provided not only the word, but a philosophical explanation of the word to the council. In this, we have once again encountered the phantoms of the Egyptian religion and the endless mystery cults it generated lurking in the hallowed halls of Christian orthodoxy. At this point, we still wonder how any of the ideas of convicted heretics like the Gnostics could ever have come to be viewed as orthodox in the Church. Had not respected proto-Orthodox authorities such as Irenaeus and Hippolytus loudly condemned the Gnostics of their day? The sanitization efforts of Orthodox historians have long obscured the fact that Christianity in the 2nd century was far more diverse and far more Gnostic than has commonly been believed. By mid-century, Gnostic teachings had grown immensely popular in the academic hubs of the Roman Empire, particularly in Rome and Alexandria. Its riveting theology of inner knowledge and escapism offered a significant challenge to the proto-Orthodox bishops, who struggled to gain and maintain influence over the Church. The controversy surrounding Marcion of Sinope, who lived from 85 to 160 CE, a fascinating and powerful Gnostic leader, provides an example of the difficulty experienced by the Catholic Fathers. Marcion, like many other Gnostics, taught a docetic Christ, rejected the God of the Jews as an evil demiurge, and aggressively argued for the Christian elimination of the Old Testament. Marcion considered himself a follower of Paul the Apostle, whom he believed to have been the only true apostle of Jesus Christ. Early church fathers such as Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, and Tertullian denounced Marcion as a heretic, and he was excommunicated by the Church of Rome in around 144 AD. His teachings were so influential that scholars have estimated that Marcionite churches far outnumbered proto-Orthodox churches between 160 and 170 CE. It's even possible that the majority of Christians in that era completely rejected the Hebrew Bible. We may gain even further insight into how powerful Gnostic Christianity had become from the fact that, according to Tertullian, Valentinus himself was a strong candidate for Bishop of Rome. In other words, a Gnostic nearly became Pope. In response to this phenomenon, prominent proto-Orthodox bishops and teachers were forced to publicly confront the Gnostic arguments. Theologians such as Irenaeus of Lyon and Clement of Alexandria composed many spirited polemical discourses against them. Around 180 CE, Irenaeus argued for the unacceptability of Gnostic Christianity, particularly Valentinianism, by tracing its historical development through long genealogies, which culminated in various unsavory characters of history. Clement of Alexandria lived from 150 to 215 AD. A pagan convert, was an influential theologian and head of the famous catechetical school of Alexandria. Platonist by training, and the one who had argued that Greek philosophy had originated in Egypt, Clement would also train or at least influence the renowned scholar Origen. Like other proto-Orthodox theologians, Clement did not share the negative Gnostic outlook on the created world or the Hebrew Scriptures. However, in Clement, we may nevertheless detect evidence of a shadowy exchange between Gnosticism and proto-Orthodoxy. As some scholars have noted, Clement's philosophical and theological struggle with alternative hetero-Gnostic doctrines left a visible mark on his own thought. However, his comprehension of hetero-Gnosticism is as complex as his attitude towards Judaism and is far from being utterly negative. But how could such a respected Christian leader have possibly entertained an even obliquely favorable view of Gnostic doctrine. More than that, Clement had been discovered by recent scholarship to be profoundly imbued with the thought of his Gnostic adversaries. Clement's environment is key to understanding the mechanics behind his subtle adoption of Gnostic ideas. As noted earlier, the city of Alexandria was the philosophical capital of the ancient world, and in that world religious syncretism was in vogue. Clement himself once said that truth is like a river which receives tributaries from every side. But as theologian W.R. Inge writes, where he says, "The river of speculative theology at Alexandria was like the Nile Delta, so that he would be a very learned or a very confident man who should attempt to define precisely the obligations of an Alexandrian Jew, Christian, and Greek to each other. At Alexandria, there was too much interchange of thought for it to be possible to label each doctrine with the name of a nationality or creed. This was the cloudy atmosphere in which Clement set out to challenge Gnosticism." End quote. Not surprisingly, modern scholars observe how Clement's extended public disputation with the Gnostics actually exposed their similarities. Some even recognize direct parallels between Clementine and Valentinian exegesis of the Scriptures, and even Clement's adaptation of their interpretations in his own theology. As theologian Henry Chadwick notes, where he says, with the teachings of Basilides, and more especially of Valentinus, Clement found himself in a fair degree of sympathy. End quote. Clement exemplifies a strain of Alexandrian Christianity which rejected most of the Gnostic views, but found their mystical Christology and speculative exegesis not entirely useless. There was evidently some advantageous property to extract, adapt, and rename orthodox. Thus the Alexandrian apologists became embroiled in a crypto-gnosticism. They publicly denounced Gnostic thought, while quietly permitting it in through the back door. Camouflaged by both the ingenious syncretism of the philosophers and the public assurances of the heresiologists, the infiltration of Gnostic sensibilities into the most prominent proto-Orthodox schools was achieved. Clement concealed his tendencies very well. He even described the true doctrine as being, and I quote, "covered over and hidden and kept for the husbandmen of faith and nobody else." End quote. The idea of secret knowledge was strong with Clement. Scholars have thus placed him in the midst of the Gnostic milieu by accepting the tradition of secret gnosis. He even touted a new vision of what he called Christian Gnosticism. To him, a pure, true, and orthodox form of gnosis meant only for the elect. For Clement, the true Gnostic is a Christian who rejects all passion in favor of the divine knowledge that was in Christ until his own soul is ultimately detached from the material realm and assimilated to God, becoming truly angelic. For Clement, this Gnostic return to the divine could only be achieved by reaching a pureness of mind. Total impassibility was the Gnostic's goal. The pre-existent Jesus himself, he claimed, was impassible, and after assuming flesh, he trained it to the condition of impassibility. Just as the Gnostics, Corinthus and Ptolemy, uniquely applied the Platonic ideal of impassivity to Jesus' teaching that Christ was free from the passions of life and unable to suffer or feel pain. Likewise, Clement said that Christ was in general dispassionate, and no movement of feeling penetrated him, whether pleasure or pain. And just as Valentinus taught that Jesus' body received heavenly sustenance, Clement also said that Christ only appeared to require food. But again, Clement had cloaked his predispositions. As one historian explains, the obscurity of his style prevented Clement from suffering condemnation like Origen in later centuries. Another scholar suggests, where he says, it is not impossible that he avoided rejection by the church as a Gnostic primarily because Irenaeus wrote his polemic against the Gnostics before Clement's time. End quote. Interestingly, later Christians appear to have rediscovered Clement's heretical links. Photios of Constantinople lived from 820 to 893 CE, the most prominent patriarch of the 9th century, eventually condemned the ancient Alexandrian as a heretic. But Clement had already influenced the great Origen, and Origen had already influenced an entire generation of 4th century Alexandrian philosophers, including Athanasius, the champion of Nicene orthodoxy. So was the damage already done. One voice highlights our anxiety on this point, where he says, "How is one to distinguish between the Christian Gnosticism, which is orthodox, or comparatively orthodox in Clement of Alexandria and Origen, and the Christian Gnosticism, which is heretical in Basilides or in Valentinus?" As one encyclopedia so appropriately demands, where it says, "We cannot omit the observation that the Christian Church in later centuries, to a certain extent, traveled again over Gnostic ground in its sacramental theories, and fully developed Christological speculations." End quote. We must emphasize that this subterranean Gnosticizing was by no means confined to Clement or his era. For example, the later Lucius Lactantius, who lived from 250 to 325 CE, he was a highly educated theologian who became a chief religious advisor of Emperor Constantine. He likewise stood in the tradition of the philosophical Gnosis of Alexandria. As scholars reveal, Lactantius constructed his doctrines in obvious dependence on the Gnostic, especially Hermetic, but clothed it, following Clement, at the same time in the dress of official theology. As we will see later in this series, Lactantius may have even personally played a decisive role in the establishment of Christian dogma at Nicaea. In the western half of the empire, Rome proved just as hospitable to Gnostic sensibilities as Alexandria. The Roman bishop Marius Victorinus, who died sometime after 355 CE, is significant not only for his presentation of the Christian God in terms of Neoplatonism and his great influence on Augustine of Hippo, but for another reason largely unnoticed by earlier historical analysis. Modern scholarship now realizes that Victorinus used Gnostic texts to facilitate his own Trinitarian vision. Only since the 1990s have scholars been able to demonstrate how closely the Orthodox Victorinus' work mirrors the Gnostic literature discovered at Nag Hammadi, sometimes word for word. But how could such a respected member of the Church have done this? It has been suggested that Victorinus was reading an explicitly Gnostic text, rejecting Gnosticism, and in the same instance transforming some of its ideas into his own theories, adopting certain of its expressions. During the embryonic stages of Nicene Trinitarian development, some proto-Orthodox bishops, both in Rome and in Alexandria, evidently found Gnostic literature useful. Scholars have now noted striking similarities between Victorinus and the Gnostics triad. One example can be found in an important Gnostic work called the Gospel of the Egyptians, which states of God, it says, 3 powers came forth from him. They are the Father, the Mother, and the Son. End quote. Victorinus likewise clearly identifies the Holy Spirit as the Mother of Christ, and furthermore writes, God is triple powerful. He has 3 powers. The Gnostic keyword here is tridynamos, triple power. Thus we find in Victorinus yet another crypto-gnostic. He presents his very own specific theory of the Trinity, which also includes Gnostic notions. Modern scholars such as Tuomas Razimus, who is an Academy of Finland research fellow at the University of Helsinki, he has written and edited books on Gnosticism, Stoicism, Platonism, and the early reception of the Gospel of John. In his research, he has affixed a Gnostic background to the Orthodox Victorinus. Likewise, Bible scholar Louise Abramowski emphasizes both Neoplatonic and Gnostic thought in his writing, and even detects his direct knowledge of Valentinianism. We must remember that in Rome, Gnostics were highly assimilated members of the Church. we recall that Valentinus was nearly made a bishop there. All of this may lead us to conclude that Marius Victorinus himself either belonged to or was heavily influenced by what Abramowski calls a Crypto-gnostic and Nicene circle in Rome. Could evidence of this circle confirm a compatibility or an association of Gnostic thought with Nicene Christianity? Could this circle and others like it in Alexandria have paved the way for the later production of the Orthodox Trinity after Nicaea? That some of the most powerful supporters of Nicene theology in the 4th century were inundated with Gnostic sensibilities cannot be denied. Augustine of Hippo of 430 CE provides the best example of this, and is in fact the greatest of all the crypto-gnostics of the 4th century. Augustine's voluminous writings certainly gave shape to the emerging doctrine of the Trinity, and his unique models would ultimately be taken up as orthodox in the West. However, mostly lost in the public memory is Augustine's pre-conversion life as a student of the Gnostic prophet Mani. Mani, who lived from 216 to 274 CE, was an influential Persian mystic from Babylon. Born the son of a Gnostic father, at 12 years old, Mani had experienced visions of a figure describing himself as Mani's heavenly twin, who called upon Mani to preach the true message of Jesus Christ. He journeyed to Afghanistan, where he studied Hinduism and Buddhism, and upon returning to Persia, he claimed that he was the last messenger, the Comforter, promised to the world by Jesus in John 14:26. John 14:26 says, "And the Helper, the Holy Spirit, which the Father will send in my name, it will teach you all things, and bring to your remembrance all that I said to you." Mani gained some significance in the royal court before his terrible martyrdom, and the popular sect that followed in his footsteps stretched across the ancient world. Augustine studied for 10 years as a hearer in this Manichaean sect. The complex teachings of the Gnostics were attractive to Augustine because, as he himself admits, he craved, in excessive vanity, to be thought elegant and urbane. Like other Gnostic groups, Manichaeism taught a highly developed dualistic worldview, emphasizing the continuous battle between spiritual good and material evil. In the Manichaean view, sex and procreation were seen as negative activities that trapped immortal souls in the bondage of inherited corruption. They held that humanity was polluted with evil from birth. This teaching had a considerable effect on the thinking of Augustine, who himself famously struggled with sexual desires. We can see how liberating the Manichaean doctrine must have been for Augustine. His situation, they had explained, was the fault of his material state. Eventually, Augustine was inspired by the conversion of the Neoplatonist and crypto-gnostic Marius Victorinus. He was baptized himself in 386 CE, and soon began to exert great influence over the Western Church. It is clear, however, that Augustine brought his Gnostic concerns with him when he converted. For example, the Manichaean views of sex, procreation, sin, and election were adapted and preserved in his Orthodox teaching. Scholars confirm that Augustine's view of humanity was a heritage of gnosis which had not been fully overcome, but was only translated gnosis. While on the one hand publicly condemning the radical Gnostic dualism of his former Manichaean brothers, their thinking continued to be alive within Augustine's teachings on mankind and its history as absolute separation of the called and the rejected. Despite his public antagonism with the Manichaeans, their worldview was still the energizing power behind much of Augustine's most characteristic thought, and experts on Gnosticism have long recognized this. What is Augustine, then, if not a crypto-Gnostic in the spirit of the earlier Clement and Victorinus? Through Augustine, a transformed Manichaean worldview eventually came to soundly dominate later Christian thinking. Gnostic theology is thus confirmed to be still enabling Christian doctrine all the way into the 4th century. The process of Catholicizing Gnosis initiated at the beginning of the 3rd century, clearly reaches its zenith in Augustine. It was the early assumption of these sensibilities of the Gnostic thesis about the deity of Christ, which provided the fertile soil in which the eternal Jesus of Nicaea could be grown. Indeed, one professor says, and I quote, "A Gnostic theory was rejected, but sooner or later it was annexed by the Church to its own fundamental notions. It was with this background and formulae that the Nicene party at first entered into debate with the Arians." End quote. The entire Trinity theory surrounding the Nicene Jesus may in fact prove to be only the Catholic working out of the original Gnostic ideas. And as we will see, the Trinity may have only avoided defeat in the 4th century thanks to the timely resurrection of acutely Gnostic definitions. It may come as no surprise that according to ancient sources, the most fundamental orthodox delineation of God's triadic nature, 3 hypostasises or persons, was already manufactured and in use by the Gnostic heretics before any of the Catholic councils had ever convened. This was pointed out during the Arian controversy by the 4th century theologian Marcellus of Ancyra of 374 CE, who argued that this model had come directly from the teachings of Valentinus. Marcellus protested where he said, "These then teach 3 hypostasises just as Valentinus, the heresiarch, first invented in the book entitled by him On the Three Natures. For he was the first to invent 3 hypostasises and 3 persons of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and he is discovered to have stolen these ideas from Hermes and Plato." End quote. But exactly what were these hypostasises in the Valentinian system? Was the Gnostic teaching truly similar to later orthodoxy? The meaning of the word hypostasis changed throughout philosophical history. Among the ancient Greeks, the term had first been synonymous with ousia, being or substance. The great Socrates had never used hypostasis but preferred ousia. Plato likewise never used hypostasis. The Stoics were really the first to use the word, and to them it meant substance or objective reality. The Latin Stoics also used hypostasis and the Latin term substantia synonymously, indicating that the original Greek meaning was indeed synonymous with ousia, substance. In the 3rd century CE, the word would eventually be used by Plotinus to describe the 3 principles of reality. We find the earliest Christian use of the word actually in the Greek New Testament. The term is used several times to indicate assurance, substance in a non-technical sense, or reality. For example, in Hebrews 11, verse 1, we read, "Now faith is a well-grounded assurance, hypostasis, of that for which we hope, and a conviction of the reality of things which we do not see." Once in Hebrews 1, verse 3, the word is applied to God and is used to describe God's one being or substance. As theologian and scholar Josilav Pelikan explains, this New Testament usage of hypostasises actually appears to be biblical evidence against the formulation of 1 ousia and 3 hypostasises. End quote. Clearly, the early Jewish Christian usage continued to be a synonym for ousia, just as it had been with the Greeks. But if both the earliest Jewish Christians and the Greek philosophers used hypostasis to mean substance or reality, how did the later Gentile Christians ever come to use hypostasis to mean person, as in Valentinus, and ultimately as in Orthodox Trinitarianism? Orthodoxy, though obviously influenced by Neoplatonism, did not learn its view of hypostasis from Plotinus. Despite any personification language, it is clear that to Plotinus the word still did not mean person. He continued to view the Platonic hypostasises as merely the underlying principles beneath everything we experience. Indeed, to Plotinus, as to Plato and Aristotle, hypostasis meant the underlying essence or principle of things. To the one, or good, he would not allow even any hypostatic character. In the Platinian vocabulary, hypostasis did not mean an individual or a person. The one, mind, soul were in no sense persons. Thus we are pressed to conclude that the definition of hypostasis as person was provided by the Gnostics. Indeed, it is the expressly Gnostic concept of hypostasis and the related concept of emanation that later Orthodox Trinitarianism echoes. As many scholars reveal where they say, and I quote, "The concept of hypostasis has a particular importance in Gnosticism. According to the Gnostics, from pre-existing principles, there gush forth a multiplicity of existences or hypostases. What defines the Gnostic hypostasises is that they are in some way incarnate in a personal entity. For the Gnostics, the hypostasises were not simply underlying principles or substances, they were distinct intellects or persons." End quote. As Tertullian explains in his writings against the Valentinians, although they would have the deity be alone, they assigned to him a second person in himself and with himself. End quote. Plotinus was especially frustrated by the Gnostic usage of hypostasises. According to him, the Gnostics were wrongly teaching that the different hypostasises were different intellects within God. He accuses the Gnostics of misusing Plato's writing to proof text their notion of the hypostasises while missing the plain meaning of the passage, and he regularly criticizes their abuse of Platonic language. Plotinus ultimately argues against their plurality of persons in God in this way, where he said, "We are not warranted in affirming a plurality of intellectual principles. This would give us two beings." End quote. But the Gnostics saw things differently. In the Valentinian view, the pleroma or fullness of God was unitary. It was the one divine being of God. But within this fullness dwelled distinct persons or intellects. As Tertullian explains, Valentinus had included these in the very essence of the deity. The Gnostics had disagreed with Plotinus's critique of their doctrine. Their hypostasises were not different beings, though the term hypostasis still referred to the one God. Incredibly, this is the same peculiar sense in which this language is employed by later Orthodox Trinitarianism. As one scholar explains, and I quote, "Though hypostasis had meant something quite different to earlier Christians, it prevailed in a definitive way only from the time of Athanasius as a way to express the ontological relation implicit in the doctrine of the Trinity. One God in three hypostasises. The three hypostasises or existences refer to one sole substance." End quote. Let us observe how closely the Gnostic hypostasises really parallel the later Trinitarianism. According to Tertullian, the Gnostic God's pleroma or fullness was considered a single substance or essence. Various principles or attributes existed within God's substance, particular characteristics such as felicity, only begotten, self-existent, and faith, and these ultimately translated to personal hypostasises. These hypostasises were seen as homoousios or consubstantial with one another. Each were themselves manifestations of the fullness or the entirety of God, and the hypostasises ultimately represent modes of God. These hypostasises were seen as homoousios, consubstantial with one another. Each also bears the entire essence or fullness of God. For the 4th century Trinitarians, the essence of their doctrine is that the one Godhead exists simultaneously in three modes of being or hypostasises. They come to be termed modes of coming to be, modes of existence. Thus, in both the Gnostic and the Orthodox view, it is the distinctiveness of the attributes within the divine substance that yields God's manifestation in personal hypostasises without causing a division of being. And these hypostasises are homoousios with one another and are in themselves the fullness of God and are modes of God's being. Another related Gnostic feature in orthodoxy is the concept of emanation or procession of hypostasises. Emanation differs from the idea of creation or formation. In this model, God projects manifestations of himself, but is in no way diminished in quality or quantity. The Gnostics used the illustration of the sun and its rays. The sun was not diminished by its projection of the rays, and while the rays themselves were of the same essence, they were distinct from it. It is often thought that Orthodox Christianity learned emanation from the Neoplatonist Plotinus. Don't say that 10 times fast. However, modern scholars now recognize that even before the Neoplatonists, a number of Gnostic thinkers were developing schemes by which a hierarchy of transcendental beings emanated from a single source by a process of dynamic emanation. As theologian John D. Turner reveals, where he says, although Plotinus has often been credited with being the first major philosopher to elaborate such a scheme, it is clear that similar models of a dynamic emanation are beginning to develop in Gnostic thought, some of which chronologically precedes Plotinus. End quote. Irenaeus was indeed already condemning this concept as expressly Gnostic decades earlier. However, we find that by the 3rd century, the later Christian Tertullian had no problem revising this Gnostic theory for his own purposes, and even used the Valentinian term probola, procession, to describe it. In his view, when the Son and Spirit emanated out from the Father, even though they continued less of the divine substance and were subordinate to God, they remained completely unsevered from their source. Regarding his explicit use of Gnostic language and ideas, Tertullian advises his readers to flinch not and to never mind heresy, where he says, truth must not therefore refrain from the use of such a term, and its reality and meaning, because heresy also employs it. End quote. Ultimately, this adaptation ushered Gnostic emanationism into the conversations of the 4th century, as one encyclopedia says, in the final establishment of the Trinitarian doctrine, the idea of emanation undoubtedly played a part, as in the emphasis laid upon the Son's being begotten, not made, which comes from the Nicene Creed, and the procession of the Holy Ghost. End quote. In reality, much of what later became the revealed dogma of Christianity, today still widely viewed as descending from heaven upon the Church, should really be seen as a retreading of Gnostic waters, as a relapse into the inevitable side effects of the old Gnostic thesis that Christ is by nature God. As we will see later in the series, it is Origen, Athanasius, and the Gnosticized proto-Orthodox tradition emanating out of Alexandria that would first endeavor to stitch these side effects together into the theological superstructure of orthodoxy. As we have observed and will continue to observe, the philosophical transformation of the Christian faith was achieved by the combined power of the influx of converted Platonists, the long and harrowing interchange with the Gnostics, and the great pressure to acclimate the Jewish faith of the New Testament to a wider religious world. Looking back, the eventual triumph of orthodoxy came at a serious price. The fact that Christianity's response to the Gnostic heresy included a great deal of compromise shows us how desperately the victory was won. As German historian Hans Blumberg so pointedly recognized, where he said, the Gnostic trauma of the first post-Christian centuries goes deeper than that of the bloody Roman persecutions. End quote. In the end, the decline of Gnosis as a unique religious force was achieved in the empire by a twofold process. First, the Christian Church had adequately adapted to its environment and accepted Gnostic concerns and the cultural heritage of antiquity into its theological message. Second, the Orthodox party eventually employed the power of the state against Gnostic adherents resisting assimilation. But any account of the eventual defeat of Gnosis by the Orthodox must include a seizure of Gnostic territory, a sacking of its stores, and ultimately a victorious return to the confines of Catholicism with a train of Gnostic plunder. Even at this stage, we are already able to see when the great Gnostic schools met their end in the era following Nicaea. Their Christology was by no means extinguished. Gnostic Christianity's unabashed separation of the human and the divine in Jesus was only muted and internalized. The radical form of early Gnostic ideas about Christ was set aside, but not the consequences which are at its root. Our wider study will reveal that the Gnostic Jesus was not eliminated, but was only translated into a more palatable language and presented once again to the Church in an age far removed from his first controversy, an age when his memory had grown dim enough and the unity of the Church had grown fragile enough that he seemed to present a more reasonable and necessary solution than he once had. Indeed, time and circumstance had made the Gnostic Jesus unrecognizable, and he continues to go unnoticed today for the same reasons. In conclusion, we ask, who can now maintain that Christianity ever truly overcame the Valentinian doctrine of the two natures? This was only one facet of the overarching philosophical Platonic metamorphosis of the Church. The pagan doctrines of the immortal soul, the transmigration and incarnation of the soul, the subsuming of impersonal human nature, the divine hypostasises. Without these, what would be left of Christian orthodoxy? As one 16th century reformer recognized, early Christianity was weakened by Platonic philosophy and embraced Aristotle instead of Christ. End quote. But the Reformation still appears drastically incomplete. Looking around at the most popular forms of Christianity today, we scarcely detect any practical difference between the hymns of the mainstream churches celebrating triadic mysteries and the numinous liturgy of the Gnostics. As German theologian Kurt Rudolph said, one can almost say that Gnosis followed the Church like a shadow. The Church could never overcome it. Its influence had gone too deep. By reason of their common history, they remain two hostile sisters. End quote. In future videos, we will continue to investigate how the adoption of Gnostic theology was achieved in the wider Church, which Christians were responsible, and exactly how that process laid the groundwork for the establishment of dogma at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. Okay, I'm going to end this video here, but stay tuned for my next video, where we must turn back time once again and revisit the earliest period of Christian origins in order to introduce a wider view of the state of the Christian faith and its relationship to Trinitarianism leading up to the drama of the 4th century. So stay tuned for that, and thanks very much for watching.